Hello, my name is Tatum, and this is how my sister turned her wedding into my public funeral, with a microphone, a champagne flute, and a smile. She called me used goods. The whole room laughed. Even my mother clinked her glass like it was a toast to my humiliation. My son was sitting next to me, still believing we were part of something good, and he asked, "Why, Mama?" And I didn't have the words, so I stood to leave. But the groom did something none of us expected. You ever wonder what it takes for someone to finally break the silence in a family that's been trained to ignore you? The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and slightly scented like lavender soap. It arrived on a Monday afternoon, wedged between a medical bill and a grocery store flyer, like a small, elegant insult pretending to be a gesture of inclusion. I opened it slowly, not out of anticipation, but caution. The calligraphy was beautiful, no doubt done by a hired professional. And yet, my name had been spelled wrong. Tatum Marson, it read, not Marston. Marson, as if after all these years, after everything, even my name wasn't worth the extra second of double-checking. My fingers tightened slightly as I unfolded the card. Silas's name wasn't mentioned. Instead, a generic +1 child sat in faint script next to mine, like he was an optional footnote, not a person. Not a grandson, not family. I sat there at the kitchen table, the cheap laminate cool beneath my arms. I read it again and again, hoping I'd missed something. A note, a postscript, a "sorry we've been distant, would love to see you." But there was nothing, just directions to the venue, RSVP instructions, and the date. April 14th, Seraphine's big day. I placed the card down slowly and stared out the window. The trees outside had just started to bud, new life trying to push through old bark. Silas was coloring on the floor, humming to himself, completely unaware that I was trying to decide whether to walk back into a room that had shut itself on me a long time ago. "I got invited," I said aloud. The words sounded foreign and thin. Silas looked up. "To what?" "Your Aunt Seraphine's wedding." He grinned. "Do we get to go?" That word, "we," carried so much weight in that moment. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I couldn't bear to be the reason he missed out on something he still believed in. We went dress hunting the next weekend. I couldn't afford anything new, so I scoured a local thrift store in Eugene. I found a navy wrap dress, slightly worn at the seams but still graceful. It fit. Mostly. Silas, meanwhile, wore the same blazer we'd used for his school recital, with a new button sewn in where the old one had popped off. The morning of the wedding, I did my makeup in the bathroom mirror. The light flickered occasionally, and there was a crack in the top corner of the glass that split my reflection just enough to feel symbolic. "You look nice, Mama," Silas said, smiling through a mouthful of cereal. I turned to him and smiled back. "So do you, baby." As we drove to the venue, a boutique hotel nestled along the edge of Willamette River, I tried to manage my breath. The parking lot was already half full, and the soft sounds of string instruments carried from inside the building. I squeezed Silas's hand as we walked in. A woman at the check-in table glanced at her list. "Name?" "Tatum Marston, with my son Silas." She frowned. "Oh, you're at table 11. Just follow the signs. Past the fountain." "Thank you," I said, but her eyes had already moved to the next guest. Table 11 was tucked behind a thick column near the far end of the ballroom. From that corner, the head table was barely visible. The people at my table were strangers, friends of the groom's family maybe. No one looked familiar. No one said hello. I pulled out Silas's chair. He climbed in, legs swinging, eyes wide at the chandelier above. "This place looks like a castle," he whispered. I nodded. "It does." I scanned the room, searching for familiar faces. Judith, my mother, was seated 2 tables from the front, surrounded by Seraphine's friends, her laughter high and polished like the silverware. Our eyes met briefly. Then she looked away, mid-conversation, like seeing me had reminded her she left the oven on. I adjusted Silas's collar and tried to sit up straighter. A server passed with champagne flutes. He stopped at the table next to ours, offering everyone a glass, then moved on. No tray for table 11. Silas tugged at my sleeve. Can I go say hi to Aunt Seraphine? Let's wait, I said gently. She's busy right now. He settled back, disappointed, but compliant. I reached for my water glass, but it was empty. No one had refilled it. I looked around again. All these people smiling, chatting, hugging. It felt like a scene from a movie I wasn't cast in. I was just extra footage. A background figure no one noticed. I watched Judith lift her glass, laughing with a woman I didn't recognize. That same laugh she'd reserved for dinner parties and holiday photos. The one I hadn't heard directed at me since before I gave birth to Silas. I leaned toward my son and whispered, "Just be still, okay?" He nodded. And I sat there, in my seat, in my dress, with my son beside me. Invited, yes, but not included. I watched the ice melt in my untouched glass and felt something in me do the same. Not explode, not break, just dissolve. The music shifted, something classical floating just loud enough to nudge the mood upward. Across the room, servers glided between tables with trays of sparkling drinks and little white napkins folded like swans. From where I sat, still at table 11, tucked behind that ridiculous decorative column, I couldn't see the head table unless I leaned far to the right. I'd stopped trying. The people at my table were polite, but distant. I might as well have worn a name tag that said seat filler. Silas was tracing circles in a drop of water on the tablecloth, his fork resting beside an untouched roll. I could feel the warmth of his shoulder pressed against mine, anchoring me in place. A second later, laughter burst out from one of the nearby tables. My eyes flicked toward the sound, catching two of my aunts, Aunt Gloria and Aunt Renee, leaning toward a woman in pink chiffon, clearly sharing a story. "Well," Gloria said, with a smirk I'd known since childhood, "she's just around, not really part of the core family anymore." I didn't flinch, but the heat in my cheeks betrayed me. I didn't need to guess who she was. I kept my head still, pretending I hadn't heard. My stomach tightened, and I reached for the water glass, empty again. Silas stayed focused on his table artwork, thankfully oblivious to the slow erosion happening 2 feet above him. The speakers squealed lightly, and someone tapped a microphone. A woman's voice, probably the planner, invited guests to turn their attention toward the gift table, where Seraphine and Callum would be doing a short gratitude moment. Great. The room's attention shifted, and I shifted with it, but from the periphery, I could see Seraphine now, only because she'd moved near the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of rosé in one hand and waving the other like she was hosting a talk show. They began opening a few gifts live, mostly for the sake of photos. Monogrammed towels, designer candles, a signed cookbook from a famous food blogger Seraphine once collabed with. Then, Callum held up a small white box wrapped in delicate ribbon and handed it to her. I recognized it instantly. It was the antique lace handkerchief, the one I had pulled from my drawer 2 nights ago after Silas went to bed. It had belonged to our grandmother. Judith said it was meant to be passed to the bride with the most grace. Of course, it had skipped me. I had written no note. I didn't want to give them words to ignore. Seraphine held it up like a child handling a dusty museum piece. "This is charming," she said into the mic. "No idea who it's from, but I'm sure we'll find a use." A ripple of laughter again. Not cruel, just dismissive. And yet, it landed like a slap. I watched as she handed it off without a second glance. Judith didn't look my way, didn't blink. I stayed seated. I didn't say a word. Callum seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. His eyes flicked toward the far side of the room, maybe even toward me. But then he followed her lead and moved on. As the crowd applauded, Seraphine and Callum began their lap around the tables, like royalty blessing the masses. I tensed when I saw her veer in our direction. She approached table 11 with that same synthetic grace she used in interviews and family photos. Her heels clicked gently against the tile as she leaned slightly toward me. "You made it," she said with a tilt of her head. Then she looked at Silas. "You're growing so fast. Hope you're being good for your mom." And just like that, she turned and walked away, before I could answer, before I could even finish forming a reply. Silas looked up at me, confused. "Did Aunt Sarah forget to say hi?" "She said hi," I murmured, forcing a smile. I watched her walk back to Callum, who was chatting with Judith now. They made a triangle of smiles, perfectly lit by the golden ceiling bulbs above. My dress suddenly felt tighter. A few minutes passed, then a man at the table beside ours, gray suit, strong cologne, nodded in my direction. "Are you family?" he asked. I blinked. "Yes, I'm her sister." "Oh," he said quickly. "Didn't realize." Of course he didn't. Dinner began soon after. Servers delivered steaming plates of salmon and vegetables to every table but ours. I waited. I raised a hand. No one noticed. I finally stood and crossed the floor to the service station near the kitchen. I caught the attention of a young server and asked politely if our table had been missed. "Oh, sorry," she said, flustered. "I think there was a mix-up with the kitchen queue. I'll check." I thanked her and returned to my seat, trying to ignore the eyes I imagined following me. By the time our meals arrived, the rest of the room had already begun clinking forks and praising the chef. Silas whispered, "I'm thirsty." I looked at his glass, still empty. I stood again, this time not asking. I walked to the drink station, filled a glass of water myself, and returned. As I sat back down, Judith's voice rang out in a perfectly timed peal of laughter. It sounded like it used to when guests came over. Controlled, public-facing, proud. And none of it was for me. I stared at my food, appetite fading. The smell of garlic and lemon felt like an insult. I could feel myself receding, shrinking into the background like a stagehand behind a velvet curtain. Silas leaned his head against my arm. "Are we staying for the dancing?" "Maybe just for the cake," I said softly. He nodded, content with that answer. He didn't know that I was already unraveling inside, that each ignored glance, each polite smile that passed over me like I was furniture, felt like confirmation. I didn't belong here. Not really. Maybe I never had. But I had made it. For him. For that small boy sitting beside me who still thought family meant something. And for now, that had to be enough. The clink of a fork against crystal rang out, pulling attention toward the center of the room. Judith was already standing by the microphone, perfectly positioned between the head table and the cake display, like she'd choreographed the entire thing down to the last floral centerpiece. Her smile was the same one she wore for church fundraisers and city council mixers. Warm enough to please, but distant enough to maintain control. I recognized it. I'd spent my teenage years trying to earn it. "Thank you, everyone," she began, lifting her glass like it held something sacred instead of sparkling wine. "What a beautiful day this has been. Seraphine, darling, what a stunning bride you make." Applause followed. She waited, letting it wash over her like a pageant queen taking her final walk. "You've always been the star in this family. Driven, poised, generous. A woman who makes things happen." Judith's eyes moved across the crowd, never once touching mine. "We all hope the younger ones, especially those still figuring things out, might learn from your example." A few chuckles. Someone clinked their glass. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I just watched her, standing there in her teal silk jacket with pearls at her throat, rewriting history while holding court. "Here's to Seraphine," she finished. "The daughter who shows us what a little grace and a lot of discipline can accomplish." Everyone toasted. I lifted my water glass and touched it gently to my lips, though nothing passed through. Judith met the gaze of nearly every table, every person who mattered to her. When she got to table 11, her eyes moved directly from the man sitting next to me to the woman 2 seats down, skipping over me as if my chair were empty. Silas leaned toward me, whispering, "Why didn't Grandma say your name?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, I reached for my napkin and realized it had been twisted into a knot in my lap. My fingers must have been working on it the entire time, unconsciously binding and rebinding themselves in loops. I folded the fabric flat again and placed it on the table. "I don't know," I said finally, keeping my voice even. "Maybe she forgot." "But you're her kid too," he said, brows drawn in confusion. I nodded, trying to hold on to the little thread of composure I had left. "Yeah. I am." A server passed behind us, and I almost didn't notice him until he slowed, quietly placing a fresh glass of water in front of me and a new fork beside Silas's plate. It was done without a word. No grand gesture, no direct eye contact. But as he stepped back, he looked at me just long enough for it to count. That tiny nod, that barely there flicker of recognition. He wasn't family. He didn't owe me anything. And yet in that second, I felt more acknowledged than I had in years under Judith's roof. I looked down at Silas, who had already returned to spinning circles in the salad dressing with his spoon. His innocence was intact, for now. Dinner service began in full soon after. Plates arrived like choreography. But even then, the laughter at the front tables never really stopped. The kind that floats just above the surface, always too loud, too polished, as if scripted for some reality show they were all co-starring in. I picked at my food, moving roasted carrots around as if I could rearrange my appetite. The salmon was perfectly seared, but it tasted like cardboard. Across the room, Judith leaned down to coo at a baby in a white lace bonnet. She smiled, tickled the child's feet, then straightened up and accepted praise from whoever had just told her she'd aged backward. She looked proud, serene, like a woman who'd built an empire. I remembered being 10, sitting at our kitchen table, doing math homework while she worked on party seating charts in the other room. I'd asked her how to divide fractions. She hadn't even looked up when she said, "Use your head, Tatum, that's what it's for." Now, watching her cradle someone else's grandchild while ignoring mine, I understood exactly what she meant all those years ago. If you can't solve the problem on your own, you don't deserve the answer. Silas asked for a napkin, and I reached for one from the unused place setting beside me. He dabbed his mouth, then looked up with wide, hopeful eyes. "Do we get to dance after dinner?" I hesitated. The idea of walking onto that dance floor, of twirling beside people who'd gladly pretended I didn't exist for most of the evening, felt unbearable. "Maybe," I said, stroking his hair back gently. "Let's see how we feel after dessert, okay?" He nodded, satisfied. The dessert table opened as plates were cleared. I walked him over, helped him choose a small cupcake with blue frosting and sprinkles shaped like tiny stars. We returned to our table, and he licked the icing slowly, thoroughly, with the concentration only children seem to master. Back at the head table, Callum stood to adjust the microphone for the next round of speeches. Seraphine whispered something in his ear, and they both smiled. Perfect. Synchronized. Scripted. My seat had grown colder, or maybe it was me. The room hummed with celebration, clinking glasses, inside jokes, photo flashes. And still, I sat. Still, I stayed. I hadn't stood up. I hadn't walked out. I hadn't screamed, hadn't demanded, hadn't accused. Because that wasn't how ghosts behaved. Ghosts lingered. They drifted behind velvet curtains and stayed silent during dinner. They watched others toast and clink and kiss and never made a sound. But I was starting to wonder if ghosts could bleed. Because whatever was happening inside me, it didn't feel like silence anymore. There wasn't a punchline, not really. Just that clean slice of polished cruelty dressed up in good manners, and the applause that followed, not loud, not boisterous, but that refined, approving kind that floats politely through country clubs and PTA meetings, the kind that lets you know you've been sized up, dismissed, and filed away. I didn't move. My back stayed straight, my hands in my lap, Silas's small fingers fidgeting beside mine. The lights above seemed too bright now, the room somehow both louder and more suffocating than before. Seraphine was still holding the microphone, her face lit with that practiced smile. I watched her scan the crowd, basking in it like a performer soaking up her encore. She looked so comfortable in the spotlight, like she owned it, like she'd never once doubted her right to be there. Then, she turned toward me. "And to my little sister," she began, tone syrupy smooth. "You've always been such a vivid example." Some people chuckled. A few exchanged glances. I didn't move. "You're the strongest woman I know," Seraphine continued, lifting her champagne flute. "A single mom, unwanted but undefeated." My body froze. The word landed like a slap. Unwanted. The air shifted. A hush fell, just long enough for someone in the back to fill it with an awkward laugh. Another clinked their glass. Then it spread. Ripples of half-laughter, polite amusement, tinged with discomfort, but no resistance. I glanced down at Silas, whose head had tilted slightly, his brow furrowed. Seraphine wasn't done. She lifted her glass higher. Used goods still shine, don't they? More laughter now. Fuller. Bolder. The kind that comes when no one wants to be the one who doesn't get the joke. Then Judith chimed in from her seat near the front. Well, she called out, raising her own glass, at least she still fits into her old dresses. That one got the biggest laugh of all. The laughter didn't hurt because it was loud. It hurt because it wasn't shocked. No gasps, no one standing up, just smiles and clinks and that low-grade snickering that told me I wasn't just a target. I was the designated entertainment. I gripped the edge of the table. My knuckles turned white. "Mom," Silas whispered, tugging my sleeve. "Why is everyone laughing?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. I blinked quickly, blinking back the moisture collecting in the corners of my eyes. I wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. That wasn't going to be the memory I gave my son, that his mother broke down in a room full of people who were laughing at her like she was a character in a sitcom. I reached for my water, then set it back down. My fingers trembled slightly as I adjusted my napkin. Again. The microphone passed to someone else. A bridesmaid, I think. I didn't catch her name. I wasn't listening anymore. I was counting. 3 tables between me and the exit. Maybe a dozen steps to the coat check. If I left now, I could be in the car before the dancing even started. I could avoid the part where I had to pretend I might be invited onto the floor, where people would sip wine and smile and pretend they hadn't just laughed when someone called me unwanted. Silas kept his eyes on me, waiting. I gave him a small smile. It didn't reach my eyes, but he didn't know that yet. Around us, servers moved between tables, pouring more wine, clearing salad plates. One walked past our table without even a glance. I shifted in my seat, leaning slightly toward Silas. "Do you want to stay for dessert?" I asked him quietly. He hesitated. "Will there be cake?" "There's always cake," I said, forcing warmth into my tone. He nodded. "Then I want to stay." Of course he did. He was 7. He hadn't learned yet that some cakes came with a cost. I leaned back again, hands folded in my lap. I could feel my spine locking itself into position, holding me upright with a kind of defiance I hadn't realized was still alive in me. Judith turned in her seat, catching my eye for the briefest of seconds. She didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She just acknowledged, and then looked away. That was almost worse, because for a moment I thought she might have seen me. But no, that would have required effort. The speeches continued. Toasts from friends, a few anecdotes about Seraphine's college days, some laughter about Callum's bad cooking. None of it touched me. I was on the outside of a snow globe, watching the perfect little scene from the wrong side of the glass. One of the older guests stood to toast Judith, calling her the kind of mother we should all hope to be. I nearly laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I turned toward Silas and fixed his clip-on tie, more for the sake of my hands than his outfit. He leaned into me, resting his head against my arm. "I'm glad we came," he said quietly. My chest tightened. "I'm glad you came too," I whispered, brushing a kiss against his hair. Because this wasn't about Seraphine, or Judith, or anyone else in that room. It was about him, about showing up, about being seen by the one person who mattered most. And as much as it hurt, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me disappear. Not tonight. Silas's question came again, smaller this time, like he was afraid it might hurt more the second time. "Why did Aunt Sarah say that about you?" I didn't answer right away. His voice carried no judgment, just confusion, a child's honest wonder. He wasn't old enough yet to understand what people really meant when they smiled with their teeth but not their eyes. I exhaled, slow and controlled, pressing my hand against the table. I wasn't going to lie to him, but I wasn't going to let them be the ones to define this moment for him, either. I'd carried their versions of me long enough. I looked down at my lap. My napkin, once neatly folded, was now a twisted rope in my hands. I'd been wringing it this whole time, tightening it like a lifeline or a noose. Slowly, I uncoiled it, smoothing it out with deliberate fingers. Then I placed it on the table. Quiet, clean. "We're going to go now," I whispered to Silas, brushing the hair away from his forehead. Okay? He looked surprised, but didn't argue. He trusted me, which somehow made it all heavier. I stood, carefully pushing my chair back. No loud scraping, no theatrics, just a shift, an unspoken line being crossed. Judith didn't look up. Seraphine was laughing again, already turned toward a group of friends. Callum was nowhere near. The rest of the room remained cocooned in its own celebration, unaware or willfully blind. I adjusted Silas's collar, straightened his little blazer, and took his hand. We walked together, moving toward the back of the room, toward the quietest path out. No one stopped us. No one said a word. And still, I felt eyes, not from the head table, not from my mother, but someone was watching. We reached the foyer just outside the ballroom. The music dimmed as the doors closed behind us, leaving only the muffled beat of laughter and clinking glasses. I crouched down to meet Silas's eyes. "You okay?" I asked him. He nodded. "Are you?" I paused. "I'm getting there." He smiled, simple and pure. Then he asked if we could still get dessert on the way home. Not because he didn't care about what had just happened, but because he'd already absorbed what mattered most. We were leaving together. I stood again, my back straighter than it had been all night. We started down the long hallway toward the exit, passing framed photographs of previous weddings that had been held at the venue, each one glossier than the last. Smiles, sparkles, perfectly timed kisses, none of them real to me anymore. Halfway down the corridor, I heard a voice behind us, faint but clear. "You're really going to leave without saying anything?" I didn't turn around right away. I knew that voice. "Judith." I stopped. So did Silas. "I said," she repeated, louder this time, "you're just going to walk out, Tatum. No thank you, no apology, funny." I turned slowly, still holding Silas's hand. She was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, mouth tight. "For what?" I asked. "For making this day about you. For that display at the table. You embarrassed your sister in front of everyone." A laugh escaped me before I could catch it. It was dry, not amused, just hollow. "You mean when she called me used goods and the whole room laughed?" Judith's expression didn't change. "It was a joke. People understood that." "No, Mom, they didn't. But even if they did, it wasn't funny." She stepped closer. "This day wasn't about you, Tatum. You always find a way to bring the attention back to yourself." My grip on Silas's hand stayed steady, but I leaned slightly forward. "You sat there and let her humiliate me. You clinked your glass like it was charming. And you're standing here now, not to check on your grandson, but to reprimand me for quietly leaving." Judith's lips pressed together. Her eyes darted to Silas, then back to me. "He doesn't need to see you storm off every time things don't go your way." My throat tightened, but I didn't let it show. "No," I said softly. "What he doesn't need is to think that silence in the face of cruelty is grace. That being family means accepting disrespect just because it's served with a smile." Judith blinked. I watched something flicker across her face, briefly, before the wall returned. "You always were dramatic. And you always needed someone to blame," I replied, not with anger, but with a finality that even surprised me. I turned and kept walking. This time, she didn't follow. The night air hit us as we stepped outside. Crisp, cool, cleaner than anything I'd breathed in that ballroom. Silas squeezed my hand and asked if we could drive with the windows down. "Absolutely," I said. We reached the car, and I buckled him in. He asked again about dessert, and I promised we'd stop for a slice of pie somewhere that didn't serve shame as a side dish. As I started the car, headlights from another vehicle flashed behind me. I glanced in the mirror. Callum. He parked and got out, but didn't approach. He just nodded once, like he saw something now he hadn't before. I didn't wave. I didn't need to. The road ahead was dark, but the sky was clear. I turned onto the highway, letting the wind roll through the windows. Silas leaned his head against the seat and hummed softly to himself. I wasn't running. I wasn't escaping. I was reclaiming something they'd tried to bury a long time ago. And this time, I wasn't leaving it behind. I hadn't even reached the door when I saw him. My father, standing at the end of the aisle, next to one of the waiters adjusting a stack of unused dinner plates. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either, just standing there, shoulders a little hunched, hands folded awkwardly in front of him like he wasn't sure what to do with them. His eyes met mine. For a split second, I thought he might speak. His mouth twitched as if words were forming, but they never made it out. Instead, he looked down and stepped slightly to the side, as though clearing the path rather than stepping into it. That moment didn't sting because he said something cruel. It hurt because he didn't say anything at all. I turned back to Silas, his small fingers still laced in mine, and continued toward the exit. But the hallway ahead wasn't empty. Just past the velvet-draped archway leading to the outdoor patio, a crowd was forming. A photographer with a headset and clipboard was waving his hand, corralling people into some kind of full family photo. I recognized a few cousins, Seraphine's childhood friends. Aunt Renee was adjusting her scarf while barking about her good side. People were laughing, arranging themselves, waiting for their cue. Silas tugged at me, his voice suddenly hopeful. "Can we be in it, Mama?" I froze. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I already did. Before I could speak, a voice cut in from my left. "Oh, sweetie," said my cousin Lori, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just blood family for this one, okay?" She said it gently, as if sparing us a longer explanation, like she was doing us a favor by softening the rejection. Silas blinked up at me. "But I'm—" The photographer glanced in our direction and gave a quick, disinterested nod as if to confirm, "Yeah, not you." It wasn't the first time someone drew a line through us. It was just the first time they did it in front of my son. I knelt down beside him, brushing a speck of lint from his lapel, more to ground myself than him. His mouth was slightly open, waiting for me to explain it all. I fixed his collar and smoothed his jacket. "You look perfect," I told him. Then I stood up slowly, turned to the group, and said clearly, "He is family. And if you can't see that, maybe none of you are." The room went silent. The photographer froze, hand on the shutter. Lori's smile cracked for a second. Someone coughed. And then, like a ripple in still water, people began shifting their weight, adjusting their jackets, pretending they hadn't heard me. But they had. I took Silas's hand again. He didn't look confused anymore. He looked proud. We stepped away from the photo crowd. Judith turned her head from her place at the edge of the frame, caught my eye briefly, and said nothing. No apology, no acknowledgement, just that familiar stony expression that had defined so much of my childhood. I should have expected silence, but it didn't feel like submission anymore. It felt like cowardice. As we continued walking past the reception hall entrance, Seraphine appeared near the open doors. She glanced up just as we were passing. She tilted her head slightly and raised an eyebrow. "Really?" she said. "That's the note you're ending the night on?" I stopped, just for a breath. "I'm not ending anything," I said, without turning. "You already did that when you opened your mouth," she scoffed. "It was a joke, Tatum. Everyone laughed. You're just sensitive." "Saying I'm sensitive doesn't make you less cruel, Seraphine. It just makes you lazy." Before she could respond, a sound broke through the tension. A sharp metallic clink, a fork hitting a porcelain plate. Everyone near the reception doors turned. The sound wasn't accidental. It wasn't part of the cleanup. It was deliberate. I looked toward the head table. Callum was standing, one hand on the table, the other still holding the fork he'd just dropped with enough intent to break the noise in half. He didn't look at Seraphine. He didn't look at Judith. He looked directly at me. His expression wasn't pity. It wasn't heroism. It was something else entirely. It was anger. Real, quiet, measured anger. He held my gaze for a moment, then stepped around the head table and started walking. The room, already muted by the slap of the fork, went still. I didn't know what he was going to say. I didn't know if he would say anything at all. But for the first time that night, it wasn't my silence carrying the weight of the truth. It was his. The clang of the fork was unmistakable, not loud in volume, but deafening in its intent. It sliced clean through the cocktail chatter and lingering laughter, like a line drawn across a wedding portrait. Every head turned, and there he was, Callum, standing at the head table. Not tense, not theatrical, just still, like the silence belonged to him. His hand was resting on the edge of the table, and his gaze was fixed, straight across the room, on me. It felt like the breath left the ballroom. He didn't look at Seraphine. Not yet. He didn't even glance at Judith, who sat frozen next to the mother of the bride flowers she had picked herself. Callum stepped around the table with a calmness that felt heavier than anger. He reached the microphone at the center of the room. There was no announcement, no signal, just the quiet creak of the stand as he adjusted it slightly. Then, with one hand still loosely at his side, he leaned in. "This isn't humor," he said, voice steady. "This is humiliation dressed in lace." There it was. The first crack in the room. People shifted in their seats. Champagne flutes stopped midair. I saw someone lower their phone, suddenly unsure if it was appropriate to keep recording. I didn't move. I couldn't. My fingers gripped Silas's shoulder, stilling him beside me. His wide eyes bounced between Callum and the rest of the room. Callum continued. "I've heard more in the last 2 hours than I did in a full year of dating Seraphine," he said. "And what I've heard, what I've seen, doesn't sit right." He finally looked at her. "You told me your sister liked attention, that she was always dramatic, that she made things about herself. You told me she liked playing the victim." Seraphine's smile had cracked now, but she was trying to hold on to it. Callum didn't let up. "But I watched a woman tonight sit in silence while people mocked her to her face. I watched her stay quiet while a room full of her own blood treated her like a cautionary tale." He turned toward the crowd. "She didn't interrupt, she didn't fight, she didn't even raise her voice, but I saw the way she held herself, like someone used to being erased but too dignified to play along." A few chairs creaked. I saw someone from the back stand up slowly. A woman I didn't recognize put her purse on her shoulder like she'd just remembered she had better places to be. Callum turned to Seraphine again. "You were so busy shining that you didn't care who you burned." She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand, not rudely, but firmly enough to stop whatever protest was forming. "And you, Judith," he said, his voice shifting slightly, "you called her your daughter once. You gave a speech tonight that praised one child and dismissed the other like she was a stain you were embarrassed to clean." Judith stiffened, but still said nothing. "She showed up tonight. She dressed up. She brought her son. She sat quietly in a corner and tried to be part of your joy, even when you made sure she felt like an intrusion." The room had become a church. No movement, no whispers. Callum's voice dropped, just slightly, as if the microphone no longer mattered. "If this is the family I'm marrying into," he said, "I need to reconsider who I've been becoming." He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He simply set the microphone down on the table, gently, and walked off the small stage. He passed Seraphine without a glance. He passed Judith. He didn't even stop when a groomsman tried to speak up, just raised his hand once, and the man sat down like a schoolboy who'd been caught cheating. And then he walked, through the center of the room, down the aisle between the tables, past the candles and the camera flashes and the monogrammed place cards, right past me. Our eyes met for just a moment. He didn't smile, he didn't apologize, but he nodded once, to me, not to anyone else, and kept going. I watched the door close behind him. Silas tugged my sleeve again. "Mama, what just happened?" I couldn't explain it. Not fully. But something inside me had shifted. "I think," I said slowly, "someone finally noticed." Around us, the mood in the ballroom cracked like glass under pressure. Aunt Renee whispered, "Did he just leave?" Another cousin muttered something about family drama, then nervously reached for her drink. Judith tried to recover. She stood slowly and tapped her glass with a spoon like she could reclaim the moment, like the room would just snap back to her control. But the sound was hollow. The energy had shifted. The spotlight had moved. I saw Seraphine still frozen near the table, eyes locked on the door like she was willing it to swing back open. It didn't. The photographer, still awkwardly holding his camera, lowered it. Someone near the back called out, "Are we still doing pictures?" No one answered. And for the first time that evening, I wasn't the one who felt like an interruption. Callum didn't wait for another reaction. He stood, slowly, and for the first time since the entire circus of a wedding began, Seraphine looked afraid. Not flustered, not annoyed, afraid. I won't marry someone who thinks cruelty is charming, he said, and his words hung heavier than the chandelier overhead. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around to gauge who was listening. He simply took off the ring, set it down on the white linen tablecloth, and stepped back. The gasp wasn't loud, but it was sharp, a sound that came from Judith's table and rippled outward like a dropped stone. A man near the back muttered, "Is this real?" under his breath, but no one answered. No one moved, except Callum. He turned to me, not in hesitation, like someone trying to explain himself, but with quiet clarity. "You didn't ask to be defended," he said, "but someone needed to stand up." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not with the weight of every eye in that room swiveling from him to me, like we were part of some courtroom drama they hadn't paid to see. I just nodded, barely. That small, careful gesture a person makes when a wall inside them has finally cracked, and light has begun to leak through. Seraphine stood up so quickly her chair tipped slightly. "Callum, what the hell do you think you're doing?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even slow down. Judith reached for Seraphine's wrist. "Let him go," she whispered in that polished warning tone she used whenever someone crossed the line in public. "Don't make it worse." "Make it worse?" Seraphine snapped. "My fiancé just dumped me at my own wedding in front of 100 people. Judith's voice dropped to a whisper, the kind that sliced instead of soothed. "Because you humiliated your sister like a child in a schoolyard." "This isn't about you being dumped, Seraphine. It's about everyone finally seeing who you are." That stopped her. For a second, anyway. I felt Silas's hand wrapped tighter around mine. He didn't ask anything this time. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on Callum as he moved through the tables, toward the back of the room, toward the exit. No one clapped. No one booed. No one even raised a glass. Because for the first time the wedding was real, not staged, not curated, not filtered through Judith's lifelong campaign of image control. Real. As Callum passed by my table, his eyes met mine again. Not pleading, not proud, just steady. Then he was gone. Silence reigned. Judith stood, half turning toward the microphone still perched at the center of the dance floor, but before she could speak, the DJ, bless him, muted the mic. The silence lingered, unbroken. Someone finally whispered, "What now?" And I realized they were all looking to Judith, or Seraphine, or maybe even me, to reset the mood, to salvage the event. But it wasn't my job to save this room. It never was. I stood up, adjusted the strap of my purse across my shoulder, and took Silas's hand again. We didn't rush. We didn't hide. We walked. I passed Judith on the way out. She opened her mouth, but whatever she meant to say stalled in her throat. I didn't slow down. She had said enough over the years. Or maybe not enough. Never enough of what mattered. I held my head up, not out of pride, not as a show, but because my spine no longer curled under their weight. As we stepped outside, I felt the shift in air like a second skin peeling off, lighter, sharper, honest. We got into the car. I buckled Silas in, turned the key, and let the engine hum back to life. As we pulled out of the venue parking lot, I caught the tail end of a notification flashing across my phone screen, still sitting in the cup holder. I waited until we reached the stoplight, then glanced down. A text from a friend. "Did you see the video? It's already everywhere." Curious, I pulled into a nearby lot, parked and opened my phone. A video, just 38 seconds long, was already being shared in local Facebook groups and wedding pages. The caption read, "This groom said what everyone else was thinking." I tapped play. There was Callum's voice, steady and measured, calling out what no one else had dared to name. The camera panned from him to Seraphine, to Judith's frozen smile, to me, just barely in frame, holding Silas's hand. My face was still, but something in my eyes caught me off guard. I didn't look ashamed. I looked seen. The comments were flooding in. "She deserved better. That boy has a good mama." Finally, someone stands up for the quiet ones. I cried at this. I felt that. I didn't smile, not yet, but something loosened in my chest, just a little. "Can we get pie?" Silas asked from the back seat. I looked at him through the rearview mirror. Pie? He nodded. You said after the wedding. I laughed, a real one this time. Yeah, let's get pie. We pulled onto the main road, the sky deepening from peach to navy. I turned the volume up slightly on the radio and let the windows crack open, letting the cool breeze sweep through the car. No tears, no anger, just space. Later that night, after Silas had fallen asleep with chocolate on his chin and crumbs in his lap, I sat on the edge of my bed scrolling through the comments again. A message popped up from someone I didn't know. Thank you for staying, for showing up, for being the kind of woman my daughter can look up to. I stared at that for a long moment, because I hadn't come to be a symbol. I came to be part of something that never wanted me, and left as someone who no longer needed their permission to exist. We didn't talk much on the drive home that night. Silas fell asleep before we even reached the bridge that split downtown from the outskirts. His head tilted toward the window, his lips parted, the tie he'd been so proud to wear earlier now slightly crooked. The wind blew in through the small crack I'd left in the backseat window, and I let it stay that way. There was something about the silence, the weight of what had happened, that didn't need to be filled. When we got home, I carried him inside, still asleep, and tucked him into bed without waking him. His shoes dangled from his feet as I pulled the blanket over him. He stirred once when I kissed his forehead, mumbling something about blueberry pie. In the stillness of my small kitchen, I poured a glass of water and stood in the doorway, listening to the night. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a train somewhere along the river, normal things, gentle things. 3 days passed before the envelope arrived. It was plain, white, no return address, no stamp, just hand-delivered to Judith's front porch. I didn't mail it. I couldn't bring myself to hand it to a postal worker, to let it get processed like it was business. It wasn't. This wasn't about logistics. It was about closure. Inside was a single photograph. It had been taken nearly 2 decades ago during a family picnic. I was maybe 12. Seraphine wore her hair in pigtails, and Judith had a fresh perm she couldn't stop bragging about. We were all posed in front of a white picket fence, just another staged, happy memory. But in the photo I sent, I had cropped everyone else out, just me and Silas, now. Sitting on that same bench in the park last week, the sun at our backs. We weren't smiling for the camera, we were smiling at each other. On the back, I wrote in black ink, neat and centered, "You erased me. I rewrote my story." And that was it. I didn't need to know how Judith reacted. I didn't need a response, because it wasn't about her anymore. Word got around, not because I talked, because others did. The video Callum's cousin had uploaded didn't disappear. If anything, it spread wider than anyone expected. People shared it with captions like, "This is how you break a generational curse and silent no more." Seraphine's brand took a hit first. She lost a skincare sponsorship within the week. A podcast interview she'd been promoting for months never aired. Then Judith started getting fewer calls from her usual social circles. Community teas stopped extending invitations. Someone from her church group asked, in a not-so-innocent tone, "So, is it true?" Neither of them ever released a statement, not even a passive-aggressive Facebook post. That, more than anything, told me they knew the narrative was no longer theirs to spin. Meanwhile, I began packing. The house I rented just outside the city had always felt temporary. I'd always assumed we'd move back closer to them someday, if things smoothed out. But the truth was, that house held too much waiting. Waiting for Judith to call, waiting for Seraphine to change, waiting for someone to finally knock on my door and say, "You matter." Instead, I found a cottage, modest but surrounded by green, on the northern edge of Eugene. There were tall pines behind it and a small creek that Silas immediately claimed as his adventure trail. We moved in 2 weeks later. The walls weren't full yet, but they didn't echo. One evening, after Silas brushed his teeth and finished rinsing the sink the way I'd taught him, he sat on the edge of the bathtub with a towel wrapped around him like a cape. "Are you still sad about what they said?" he asked, looking up at me with all the earnestness in the world. I leaned against the bathroom door frame, drying my hands on the towel. "Not anymore," I said. Are you? I asked him. He shook his head, his hair dripping onto his shoulders. No, because I think you won. That moment landed in me like a stone in a still pond. Not noisy, not chaotic, but deep. Later, as he fell asleep in his new bed, I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea and watched the evening fade behind the tree line. The stars were just beginning to appear. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet, convinced that if I just held on long enough, someone would pull me into the circle, that if I softened my voice, bowed my head, bent my spine enough, I'd be loved again. But I didn't need their seat at the table. I'd built my own. The porch creaked as I shifted in my chair. I took a sip of tea, still warm, and let the quiet fill me. I didn't fight to win them back, I whispered to the dark. I stood up so I'd never lose myself again. The wind stirred the trees, gentle and sure. The past hadn't vanished. It was still there, but it didn't lead me anymore. It didn't write the script. It didn't hold the pen, and I didn't need it to apologize. Because finally, I'd stopped waiting to be invited back into a story I no longer wanted to be part of. They never apologized. I no longer need them to. That is the ending no one expected, and the one I deserved. Sometimes, walking away isn't about giving up, it's about refusing to be erased any longer. Tatum's story reminds us that family should never be a license to wound, and silence isn't always strength. Have you ever had to choose peace over approval? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might help someone else find theirs. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another powerful family story. More is coming, and you won't want to miss it.